rendered possible by freedom, and presented to us by reason as an object of respect. But yet we are subjects in it, not the sovereign, and to mistake our inferior position as creatures, and presumptuously to reject the authority of the moral law, is already to revolt from it in spirit, even though the letter of it is fulfilled. With this agrees very well the possibility of such a command as "Love God above everything, and thy neighbour as thyself." For as a command it requires respect for a law which commands love, and does not leave it to our own arbitrary choice to make this our principle. Love to God, however, considered as an inclination, pathological love, is impossible, for he is not an object of the senses. The same affection towards men is possible, no doubt, but cannot be commanded, for it is not in the power of any man to love any one at command. Therefore it is only practical love that is meant in that pith of all laws. To love God means, in this sense, to like to do his commandments. To love one's neighbour means to like to practise all duties towards him. But the command that makes this a rule cannot command us to have this disposition in actions conform to duty, but only to endeavour after it. For a command to like to do a thing is in itself contradictory, because if we already know of ourselves what we are bound to do, and if further we are conscious of liking to do it, a command would be quite needless, and if we do it not willingly but only out of respect for the law, a command that makes in this respect the motive of our maxim would directly counteract the disposition commanded. That law of all laws, therefore, like all the moral precepts of the gospel, exhibits the moral disposition in all its perfection, in which, viewed as an ideal of holiness, it is not attainable by any creature, but yet is the pattern which we should strive to approach, and in an uninterrupted but infinite progress become like to. In fact, if a rational creature could ever reach this point, that he thoroughly likes to do all moral laws, this would mean that there does not exist in him even the possibility of a desire that would tempt him to deviate from them, for to overcome such a desire always costs the subject some sacrifice, and therefore requires self-compulsion, that is, inward constraint to something that one does not quite like to do, and no creature can ever reach this stage of moral disposition, for being a creature, and therefore always dependent with respect to what he requires for complete satisfaction, he can never be quite free from desires and inclinations, and as these rest on physical causes, they can never of themselves coincide with the moral law, the sources of which are quite different, and therefore they make it necessary to found the mental disposition of one's maxims on moral obligation, not on ready inclination, but on respect, which demands obedience to the law, even though one may not like it, not on love, which apprehends no inward reluctance of the will towards the law. Nevertheless, this latter, namely love to the law, which would then cease to be a command, and then morality, which would have passed subjectively into holiness, would cease to be virtue, must be the constant though unattainable goal of these endeavours, for in the case of what we highly esteem but yet, on account of the consciousness of our weakness, dread, the increased facility of satisfying it changes the most reverential awe into inclination, and respect into love. At least this would be the perfection of a disposition devoted to the law, if it were possible for a creature to attain it. This law is in striking contrast with the principle of private happiness which some make the supreme principle of morality. This would be expressed thus: love thyself above everything, and God and thy neighbour for thine own sake. This reflection is intended not so much to clear up the evangelical command just cited, in order to prevent religious fanaticism in regard to love of God, but to define accurately the moral disposition with regard directly to our duties towards men, and to check, or if possible prevent, a merely moral fanaticism which infects many persons. The stage of morality on which man, and, as far as we can see, every rational creature, stands, is respect for the moral law. The disposition that he ought to have in obeying this is to obey it from duty, not from spontaneous inclination, or from an endeavour taken up from liking and unbidden. And this proper moral condition, in which he can always be, is virtue, that is, moral disposition militant, and not holiness in the fancied possession of a perfect purity of the disposition of the will. It is nothing but moral fanaticism and exaggerated self-conceit that is infused into the mind by exhortation to actions as noble, sublime, and magnanimous, by which men are led into the delusion that it is not duty, that is, respect for the law, whose yoke, an easy yoke indeed, because reason itself imposes it on us, they must bear, whether they like it or not, that constitutes the determining principle of their actions, and which always humbles them while they obey it, fancying that those actions are expected from them, not from duty, but as pure merit. For not only would they, in imitating such deeds from such a principle, not have fulfilled the spirit of the law in the least, which consists not in the legality of the action without regard to principle, but in the subjection of the mind to the law, not only do they make the motives pathological, seated in sympathy or self-love, not moral, in the law, but they produce in this way a vain, high-flying, fantastic way of thinking, flattering themselves with the spontaneous goodness of heart that needs neither spur nor bridle, for which no command is needed, and thereby forgetting their obligation, which they ought to think of rather than merit. Indeed, actions of others which are done with great sacrifice and merely for the sake of duty may be praised as noble and sublime, but only so far as there are traces which suggest that they were done wholly out of respect for duty and not from excited feelings. If these, however, are set before any one as examples to be imitated, respect for duty, which is the only true moral feeling, must be employed as the motive. This severe holy precept, which never allows our vain self-love to dally with pathological impulses, however analogous they may be to morality, and to take a pride and meritorious worth. Now, if we search, we shall find for all actions that are worthy of praise a law of duty which commands, and does not leave us to choose what may be agreeable to our inclinations. This is the only way of representing things that can give a moral training to the soul, because it alone is capable of solid and accurately defined principles. If fanaticism, in its most general sense, is a deliberate overstepping of the limits of human reason, then moral fanaticism is such an overstepping of the bounds that practical pure reason sets to mankind, in that it forbids us to place the subjective determining principle of correct actions, that is, their moral motive, in anything but the law itself, or to place the disposition which is thereby brought into the maxims in anything but respect for this law, and hence commands us to take as the supreme vital principle of all morality in men the thought of duty, which strikes down all arrogance as well as vain self-love. If this is so, it is not only writers of romance or sentimental educators, although they may be zealous opponents of sentimentalism, but sometimes even philosophers, nay, even the severest of all, the Stoics, that have brought in moral fanaticism instead of a sober but wise moral discipline, although the fanaticism of the latter was more heroic, that of the former of an insipid, effeminate character. And we may, without hypocrisy, say of the moral teaching of the gospel that it first, by the purity of its moral principle, and at the same time by its suitability to the limitations of finite beings, brought all the good conduct of men under the discipline of a duty plainly set before their eyes, which does not permit them to indulge in dreams of imaginary moral perfections, and that it also set the bounds of humility, that is, self-knowledge, to self-conceit as well as to self-love, both which are ready to mistake their limits. Duty, thou sublime and mighty name, that dost embrace nothing charming or insinuating, but requirest submission, and yet seekest not to move the will by threatening aught